Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming along for the last PSA political psychology um, seminar of this year. We've actually had a couple on in group, out group judgments, so there must be something in the topic. Very pleased to welcome you all here. Particularly pleased to welcome George Melios from the LSE. George is a research fellow lecturer in the Department of Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics. He's an economist by background, but works at the intersection of economics, political science, and psychology. So very relevant, particularly interested in using causal inference to identify the relationship between what people believe and the way they behave. But he's talking to us today about something slightly different: the origins of asymmetry, the evolution of out-party distrust in the US. So a very topical question. And George, I think is going to talk for about half an hour, and then we should have 25 minutes or so for questions afterwards. So unless anyone's got any questions, no, I will hand over to George.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very interested in presenting this work. I'll try to speak as less as I can so that we can actually discuss about the paper. We're very keen on getting feedback and discussion about it because we're a bit in the middle of what we're doing with it. So this is a paper with my very good friend Bauke Klein-Tisling, who is he's an assistant professor in political economy at the King's College London, at the Department of Political Economy there. It's called Origin of Asymmetry and the Evolution of Out-Party Distrust in the United States. This is the abstract. You can access the SSRN version through this QR code. And basically what we want to see in this paper is we want to touch on quite a big literature on political psychology and political behavior, even from simple social psychology literature, where there is a big debate on which side of the political spectrum is more biased or exhibits more outgroup animus than the other one. There is papers that suggest that people on the right are slightly more intolerant of people on the left. There is other people sort of proposing alternative hypotheses about it. There is some mixed evidence, and we think we can provide some resolution on this mixed evidence with this work. And the motivation of this paper actually started while we were working on a different one with Bauke. And when we started looking at how different partisans trust the current president in the United States, we saw that every time the president was changing, and it comes from a different party, there is always a huge jump from in groups that strategically trust the government, and there is a small to big decline of outgroups that hate the current president. So there seems something to be happening around every time a new president is elected and comes from a different party. And this seems to be quite consistent in all of the data we could look at. This specific graph is from the General Social Survey in the United States. The same we could find with ANES. It seemed to be consistent for the last 4 decades. And it seemed to be unanswered as a question as to why this is happening. So we started looking into it, and this relates to a sort of broader literature that Bauke and I are working at the same time, but a lot more people have worked except of us, which tries to understand the effects that partisanship has in a range of political and non-political attitudes, beliefs, choices, behaviors, almost everything. So specific motivation, and we'll discuss it in a bit, for this paper comes from an original paper in the American Political Science Review by Maurice et al. In 2019, where they basically proposed that this difference in trust when your party is in power is quite significant in the United States, and it's very asymmetric, leaning towards the Republican Party. So Republican voters trust much more Republican governments than what Democrats do with their own presidents. And this interesting asymmetry was what sparkled us looking into this. We also know that partisanship affects a number of other things, how we process information, how do we feel about the other parties, affecting polarization. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have a recent paper that it also shows that it also biases who you date, whether you want to sleep with them and what type of relationship you want to form with them. We have a different paper with Pauke that we show that these type of choices also affect how much money you are willing to donate to charities, how much money and what type of money you're going to invest in different aspects. We have another work that shows whether it will bias people's abortion decisions, even roommate choices. So there seems to be a sort of partisan sorting in different choices and behaviors that might be similarly asymmetric to what we find about trust. Therefore, we thought that it would be interesting for us to understand and try to study how this asymmetry is coming about and why, and why are we in the level we are at the moment. And we think that this work relates to a large body of literature that can talk about cross-cutting identities, social identity theory. It can also give some more evidence or flavor to the current debate on affective polarization and why is it increasing in the United States, whether it's something specific in the United States that's going on or something that we see in other countries. And how important are these types of partisan bias? How much should we care about what is going on? And we built the empirical exercise that we're doing here on the following story. So there is some evidence that says that partisans are more reluctant to grant legitimacy to governments that are governed by the other party. There is the original Morisi et al. Paper in 2019. There is another work that shows that there is this effect, but it's sort of exhibited in the same magnitude from both sides. And we can think that this can be quite significant for the democratic functioning, because on the one hand, it sort of allows partisans to not hold their parties accountable. So when I trust the government much more if I voted for them, I'm more willing to overcome corruption scandals or bad policies, or generally the effect of how we evaluate the performance of governments to trust should not be what we expect. But it also encourages partisans to undermine other party governments, to not grant them legitimacy and allow them to proceed with different policies and move on. And there is some evidence that this asymmetry that Morisi et al. Suggest also holds in other types of political behavior rather than political trust, namely polarization, where conservatives are shown to be more polarized and also exhibiting more outgroup animus towards Democrats. So what we're doing here is basically we're taking this asymmetry that was shown in the Morisi paper, and we are basically trying to answer three questions. We are trying to see, how did this asymmetry come about? Is it something that was always there? Always conservatives were more intolerant of Democrats? Was it something that evolved over time? Was it something that evolved in a particular pattern? Is it the same pattern for both parties? So is there a parallel trend where everyone hates more over time? And is there anything we can do to identify causes about how this phenomenon came about and whether the asymmetry can be attributed to any type of cause? Now, for the third question, unfortunately, we can only find some suggestive evidence. We cannot claim that we find all of the causes, or we can attribute the exact causal effect of each one. But we think we have some suggestive evidence of what's going on. So how are we doing that? So we collect data from the General Socials Survey in the United States from 1974 until the last one we had when we started this with 2021. We're looking at confidence in the federal government, which is measured in a 3-point scale from 0, I have no confidence, I have some confidence, or I have a lot of confidence. We're looking at the partisanship in a 7-point scale, which goes from strongly Republican to strongly Democrat with independents in the middle. We do some exercise with Annes using similar variables in a similar time window, and we control for as many things as we can. So income, age, gender, employment, education, race, religion, and time. And to make our model as best as we can, we allow for maximal flexibility of functional form by using all of these control variables as fixed effects, except of income, because it will kill the variation practically. But sorry. And we are trying to think of it in the following way. So we are following what we see on the descriptive graph I showed you on the motivation. So we're trying to use these turnover elections every time that the president changes from one party to the other as a natural experiment that allows us to see the two parties either aligned or not aligned with the current president and compare them to independents as a control group to use a sort of difference in difference estimator where the parties are treated with either positive alignment or negative alignment each time, and independents are always the control group. And the assumption that we are using here for identification is that in absence of treatment, independents, Republicans, and Democrats, the three groups, should have evolved over time in a sort of similar way. And if we go to the initial group, we will see that independents don't systematically change their views with the president. They have fluctuations on how much they're trusting the government on its presidency, even within its presidency, but it's not like with every single party change, they're exhibiting the behavior that the others do. So we believe that they are a good control group for this difference estimator, and we will do some robustness checks to test the parallel trends assumption. So in our main estimation, what we're doing is we're trying to see in the two most recent waves before and after its election turnover, whether the people that align with the president that got elected increase their trust in their confidence in government more, whether this increase in government, sorry, I'm very sorry, there is one microphone on and there's a bit of noise. So we are using these 4 waves before and after the elections to basically figure out whether there is a boost of confidence to the party that you voted for in every turnover election. And then we're trying to see whether this boost increases or decreases over time, and whether it's more prevalent in one of the other parties. So what do we find? So initially we find that steadily between 1997, which is our first turnover election, and 2021, which is the last one, the president in power effect, so how much more you're trusting the president when they are from your own party, increases steadily for both parties. It increases quite a lot. So for Democrats, it almost quadruples between 1977 and 2021. So in 1977, the president got a boost of about 7% more trust. Biden in 2021 got about 31% more trust in a similar way. That these results hold under a lot of different specifications, whether we use turnover elections, whether we use shrinking windows and we consider the whole sample, whether we use shifting windows across the sample, whether we exclude specific presidencies or not. The story seems to be that in partisan governments are getting increasingly more trust over time, over the last 4 decades. But at the same time, we observe something interesting, that the asymmetry that the original paper suggests is steadily decreasing over time. So Republicans initially were exhibiting a higher president in power effect, so they were highly more biased and more skeptical of out-party governments. But after 2008, so beginning with Obama, this asymmetry, if anything, reverses completely, and now Democrats are the ones distrusting more out-party governments. To give you a small sense of how the evolution and the asymmetry evolves over time, this is what we're finding. So the main effect, how much more you're trusting your government if you voted for it in 1977, is something like less than 10 percentage points. The mean effect in the last election was a bit more than 30%. And the asymmetry evolves in a way that it peaks on the Clinton-Bush election, but after Obama, it decreases. And then if anything happens, we are a bit uncertain about this confidence interval, but it basically shows that the effect is, the asymmetry is now coming from the side of the Democrats. Okay, and these results are consistent whether we use the turnover elections as a main specification, whether we use a shrinking window where we decrease our sample by 1 year every single time, or whether we use shifting windows that use 15-year periods for every single year starting from 1974 to 2021. And to give a sort of higher credibility of our estimation strategy and think around possible pre-trend violations, we are estimating the pre-trends, the parallel trends assumption for each specific turnover election, where we find that except of the Bush-Obama turnover election, we don't have any violation of pre-trends. And the effects we're picking up are consistent even when we're looking at every single window rather than the evolution that we're looking at the main effect. So there seems to be the story that we tend to trust the governments we voted for much more over time. And the Democrats do so much more than Republicans do, which is a bit in contrast to what the current literature shows. And then we shift the focus of the paper, looking at what could be the possible reasons, both for the evolution of the main effect, so both for the fact that we overtrust our government, and for the fact that this asymmetry seems to be reversing. So the first thing that we build on is that, based on social identity theory, we know that stronger party identification increases how you feel about outgroups, how much you hate them, affective polarization. So we thought about looking at the strength of partisanship over the same window, okay? And we see that the share of people that identify either as strong Republicans or strong Democrats between the 1970s and 2020 is almost double, okay? So from about 22 and 27%, we go to about 35 to 40%. Okay, so we see that the share of strong partisans in both parties increases steadily. At the same time, we try to estimate the president in power effect and the asymmetry just on this group, on these strong partisans. And we find that the strong partisans exhibit double the effect of both what we call medium partisans suggest and weakly identified as partisans. So the 7-point scale that we're using for partisanship allows us to compare how much more strong partisans are exhibiting this effect. And then we try to provide some descriptive evidence that this strong identification can partly be explained by perceived polarization between the parties. So we try to examine the evolution of how much do you think the distance is between your party's beliefs and the other party's beliefs. And we see that partisans over time, particularly from the Democratic side, perceive a growing distance between their ideology and the ideology of the opposing party. And this can partly explain our effects in the sense that it coincides and explains the increasing president in power effect, but it doesn't suggest anything about the asymmetry. It doesn't suggest why Democrats are increasingly more distrustful about party governments. And sorry, this doesn't change this. So we turn our questions about what could potentially explain the asymmetry into possible changes in the demographic compositions of the groups. So if it's not that Democrats are becoming much more strongly partisan and affiliated with their parties than Republicans are, then it might be that the composition of the group changes over time. And we're building on big literature in psychology, behavioral science, and political science that says that basically highly educated people tend to be more politically evolved, aware, more actively involved with politics, and at the same time, they exhibit a stronger outgroup intolerance in the sense that they think they're more confident about their policy views and than less educated people. And what we find is that even though the effect is much stronger for educated people, so being a graduate, having a graduate degree, is almost 3 times higher in effect than having no high school education or less than high school education. But at the same time, the stronger effect for educated individuals does not explain itself the asymmetry. But what we find quite interesting, both in terms of timing and as a descriptive effect of what we're picking up, is that there is a reversal of the difference between the average education of the average educational levels between the two parties around 2008 and 2010. So by 2008, 2010, and a bit later, Republicans were much more educated than Democrats on average, while after 2010, or practically, sorry, after the financial crisis, we see that educated individuals identify much more with the Democratic Party. And if more educated individuals exhibit higher levels of president power effect, and they switched over to the Democratic Party, there might be some evidence that the reversal of the asymmetry comes proportionally from this group. And the last thing I want to discuss before we open for a discussion is that we started wondering whether this is a phenomenon that only happens about the presidency. So I only care about who governs me, and or whether this is a more general political question. This sort of partisan bias is applied to other types of political institutions. So we looked into using the same methodology and the same data to figure out whether there is a similar Congress in power effect. So who has the power of Congress, and whether your votes were aligned with the House of Representatives and with the Senate. And we find that, again, Democrats exhibit a much more Congress in power effect for the House, but the asymmetry is not changing over time, but is in favor of the Democrats, and that this effect partly applies to the Senate, but it doesn't extend to a large degree. So it seems that it does spill over to other political institutions, but not as much as it does on the presidency. And the effect is certainly not that increasing over time. So just to wrap up how we're thinking about this paper and where we are at the moment, we saw the evolution of the president in power effect between 1974 and 2020. We saw that in contrast to existing evidence, if there is an asymmetry, if anything is going on with this asymmetry, it seems to be driven by Democrats becoming more distrusting of out-party governments than Republicans, and the same for the House of Representatives. We attribute this increasing president in power effect to people that strongly identify with their parties over time, to increased misperceptions of ideological differences between the two parties. And we attribute the reversal of the asymmetry to demographic changes of the composition of the two parties. And we are basically in a position where we're trying to answer two additional things and future implications of this work. The first question is, why does that matter so much? Like, why, except of trust, this should be of interest to political scientists and political economists? And on a follow-up paper using almost the same methodology and tax data from the IRS, we saw that the same type of effect and the same type of asymmetry is also present in other types of non-political behavior, like charitable donations. So over time, every time the presidency is the one you supported, you change how much money and what type of charities you are spending your money on. And at the same time, we're trying to see whether it's only an American phenomenon or whether it's something that spills over to other environments. We've started doing some analysis in the UK and some analysis in European institutions. There seems to be a similar story, but the effects are much smaller than what happens in the US. And I think with that, I would like to stop.
Lovely, George. Thank you very much. I mean, that was fascinating, and I mean, well done for fitting that all into less than 25 minutes. So, if we're going to go to the hour, I guess we have plenty of time for people to ask questions, comments to George. So I've got Ugo. I hope I pronounced that right, and then Joe. Should we maybe take a couple, and then we'll move on to a second round?
Sure. It's Uğur. It's the Turkish name that used there a silent G, and I've heard 55 different versions of my name, so don't worry about it.
Apologies.
No worries at all. Thanks for this, Georgios. It's great. I just have a very quick. I'm sure you have the guys noticed this, but a very quick observation. I realized that in the motivation picture you showed us, the independents are moving with the oppositions, right? So and very closely. So whoever in the opposition, so they kind of mimic the opposition group's behavior. So I suppose those colored regions are the governing party, right? So if you look at the blue bits, so the Greens are moving with the red, and if you look at the red bits, the Greens are moving with the blue. And this is true up until Obama's election. So I was just wondering if that says anything about the independents being a control, because they seem to be moving with the opposition. Thank you.
Should we maybe just take Joe's question, and then George, you can answer both of them.
Yeah. So, can everybody hear me? I put in my headphones. Okay,
Yep.
Cool. So, kind of the president in power effect is a really intriguing one. But there's also something going on during this series, in addition just to the increase in affective polarization that we see over 40 years in America. And that's sort of the interplay between the different branches of government is changing. That there's an amassing of power in the executive branch. There's a decline in not so much the policy purview of Congress. They're still legislating on a bunch of things, and if anything, increasing. But the identity of various committees decreases. Party government becomes a lot more of a thing. And so that's interlocked a bit more with the presidency. And so one sort of interesting thing that would be cool to see, and I think very easy to do with your data, would be to look at the effect of both having president in power and House and Senate in power on confidence in these various institutions, because it's not, the presidency is not in a vacuum. It's operating in conjunction with Congress, in conjunction with the courts, in conjunction with the administrative apparatus.
So allow me to go in reversing sides. So it's indeed very interesting. We've tried at some point doing something similar. So we try to see whether you are aligned with both and whether that has an impact to an index of trust, including trust in a lot of things, rather than these two things at the same time. But to be honest, I don't remember why we couldn't run it. I think there was something wrong with how much variation we had in our data. I might be wrong about it, but I remember that we couldn't figure out something specific about it. But it's interesting. I think it says a lot, though, that there doesn't seem to be a consistent decrease in how much people are trusting the Congress over time, even though Congress power is sort of losing some of its essence.
That might be a variation problem.
Yeah, but there's not much we can say about it, to be honest. Now, with regard to independence, which is the interesting methodological question, and the one we've pondered quite a lot about, to be honest. Yes, so they do seem to be moving a bit with the opposition. When you start controlling for time trends and individual characteristics, they seem to be moving a bit less than the opposition. So they're somewhere in the middle. I think it's a good evidence, and this is why we saw the preterence assumption that there doesn't seem to be any violations except of this particular Obama instance. So across time, on every turnover elections, there seem to be parallel trends between the independents and the two groups. So simultaneously, for both the opposition and the governing party, there seems to be consistent parallel trends. There doesn't seem to be a lot of people that jump into identifying with independence. So identification with independence remains sort of constant in our period, which is also partly suggestive of it might be a good control group, but it's not perfect. 100% it's not perfect of what we would like to have as a control group.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions that people have? Okay, well, I'll ask a couple, unless Rob, you go ahead.
Actually, do you want to go first, Ben? Because I've got to formulate my thoughts a bit.
Okay, I've got a few. These are rather kind of scattered, George. So in I guess in order, is there any sense in which I mean your trust scale is a kind of 3 kind of item, but I can't remember what you either have low confidence or no confidence, some confidence or a lot of confidence. I think that was right. And I just wonder whether if you looked at people, if you actually disaggregated that. I mean, I know it makes the measurement more lumpy, but actually, is it that people are getting more confident in their side, or is the effect that they're getting more distrustful when the other side takes office? I mean, you could do that. I mean, you lose some of the kind of variation in the measurement, but it just strikes me. I mean, I'm particularly interested in trust. And I just wonder whether it's, you feel more confident in your own side or whether you feel more negative towards the other side. That's one question. Then the other, two more. Another question was in the sense of, I found it very interesting the way you said there's a kind of sorting mechanism going on here. And part of the explanation is that more educated people are more prone to motivated reasoning, and they over time have become more likely to identify with the Democrats. But in a sense, Democrats have got more prone to partisan in power effects. But do you also find that Republicans have become less prone because they're becoming less educated? So on that logic, you would also expect to find that Republicans are becoming less prone to motivated reasoning and partisan in power effects. So that was question 2. And then finally, just on the wider measures, I mean, one thing that would be really interesting to look at, and I don't know whether this appears in the GSS, is people's attitudes towards democracy in general. Because in a sense, the kind of so what question, well, people are becoming more polarized, they're becoming more trustful of their own side, distrustful of the other side. But in a sense, that might be, you might say, well, that's simply the kind of, flotsam and jetsam of democratic politics. But if people are also becoming more polarized when it comes to democratic attitudes, I'm more supportive of democracy when my own party's in power, but as soon as they lose power and the opposition takes party, I suddenly become much less supportive of democracy, which some recent analyses in the US seem to suggest. That would be, I think, much more worrying. So I guess if there's anything on the GSS around that, that would be, to my mind at least, a nice extension. Since I've rabbited on, do you want to have a go at those, and then maybe I'll come back to Rob? Is that okay?
Yes, sure. So the last thing sounds very interesting. We haven't tried it. I don't remember whether there is a question, but we can certainly look into it. Thank you for that. But what I know for sure, and it also partly answers your first question, is that on the donations paper we are using the same mechanism. There seems to be both effects present at the same time, with distrust being slightly more in terms of what's going on. So what we find on that work is that I do think my government is better at solving problems. I just think at the same time that the other one is terrible at it. So it's hard to decompose which one is much bigger, but it seems that the negative one seems to be winning this argument. Now, with regards to conservatives, so what we saw is that both groups increasingly show more evidence of motivated reasoning. So both of them have an increasing effect over time. It's just that the rate of this effect is much bigger for Democrats for the asymmetry to reverse. So it's not that motivated reasoning or the partisan bias or in whatever place we put this thing. The president in power effect seems to be increasing for everyone, just with different rates. Unfortunately, it's not like there is some solution where we get less motivated reasoning.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. That makes sense. Rob.
My question is kind of prompted a bit by the discussion we were having at the start with the talk with the results you were mentioning about dating, and I suppose being in a political psychology seminar, I kind of want there to be a psychological reason for asymmetry, not some boring institutional reason about but this party is further to the right, or something to do with the interaction between the presidency and the executive and the legislative or anything like that. So my kind of general question is what would you say? Should we expect any kind of psychological basis for any asymmetry in out-party distrust, or is the psychology of this kind of equivalent across sides, and then it's the politics that creates these fluctuations you were talking about? And the specific version of that question is, it seems to me, based on that contrast we've had between quite a long-standing pattern for conservatives to distrust liberal leaders, while it seems that if anything it's liberal citizens who distrust conservative citizens the most. Is there something in the idea that actually, you know, we want conservative, right-wing, kind of maybe slightly authoritarian people running things, but we don't want them dating us or something like that? You know, there's just certain personality types that are better suited to running the show, and others that are better suited to interpersonal stuff. And I have vaguely in the back of my mind the persistent finding in Britain that other things remaining the same, people tend to prefer central government to be right-wing, but local government to be left-wing, which I think somehow makes intuitive sense. That, you know, local, just the services, the nice stuff, yeah, but ultimately at the top, you kind of need the ones who've got a stick in their hands. So I'll leave that with you.
So for the last part, sounds very fascinating. I really don't have an opinion, in the sense that I can speculate, but I don't have anything concrete. On the first part, I do think we have something concrete in combination of this paper and the dating paper. And I think what partly the psychology behind this thing is coming from two things. It seems on these two examples, and I need to be a bit cautious because the other one is an experimental paper, so the external validity might be in question on it. But I think what we're picking up is that there is some side of self-righteousness on your beliefs on the more liberal left side of the spectrum, on the sense that like my beliefs are morally better than yours, then for the fact that you don't align with them makes you whatever, bad, evil, criminal, on any side of it. So I'm using it as a heuristic to judge you on a series of characteristics that I assume you have just because you're on the right. So what we find on the dating work is that basically, no matter how much evidence you provide to me that your beliefs are close to mine, just the fact that you are right would make me not date you. Okay, so I'm assigning to that right or Republican or Tory partisanship some characteristics of, I don't know, bad morality. And therefore, this could explain why the asymmetry decreases over time and reverses for the Republicans. And what we find also in the dating paper that I find quite interesting is that, at least in the UK, the Labour voters in our experiment seem to completely ignore new information. So even when we treat them with more information that this person, for example, we treat them with characteristics that you assign to Labour Party, for example, veganism or being liberal with migration. Even if you get an extra treatment that the Tory you are meeting is a counter-stereotypical Tory, a Tory that should be closer to you than it is, people exhibit an even higher bias on that. So it's that like, if you're morally evil, but at the same time you have some good aspects, you are also inconsistent, so you're even worse. So on the psychology side, I think there is something that has to do with how right you think your beliefs are. We haven't checked whether it's similar on the strong partisan sides, because I assume that for strong Republicans, they might exhibit the same. But on the mean, it's stronger on the left than what it is on the right.
Are there other questions that people have? Just while we're on the dating, this of course is by far the most interesting aspect of this. Why I can completely understand why in your experimental setup that people's partisan attitudes and attitudes towards outgroups shapes their dating preferences. But you seem to also to suggest that the dynamic you got in your analysis of the GSS also, have I got this right, also applied to people's dating decisions? Is that right? I suppose in that case, George, my question would be, why would in a sense, why would presidential power effects have, why would kind of partisan effects have a dynamic impact just because there's turnover? I mean, it seems kind of odd to me that the mere fact of presidential turnover would also shape people's preferences for who they're going to date. Do you see my point? I can see at one point in time, do you want to date a conservative if you're a liberal? Hell no. But why that would have a dynamic picture that would be influenced simply by the fact there's turnover in national governments, that seems to be more puzzling.
So just to make clear, we haven't tested it on this thing. So we haven't used the GSS. We have some descriptive evidence that who you will be willing to date fluctuates with this, but we haven't run it on this analysis. But I think that I can think of a mechanism that explains it. So if you are an out party and I don't like you, but I want to date you, I can think of a case where I would be more willing to do so if I have power. Okay, because then the fact that you are evil or misguided or uninformed or whatever as an out party doesn't really change my life. But if at the same time I want to date you and you are driving policy or your people drive policy, then it starts becoming a problem.
Yeah, I can see that. We clearly need to have another session on dating.
In case you are interested of that, let me just give you a link of that experiment. It's very new, so any comments you might have are more than welcome. We literally just finished it but the link to that would be, 1 second. So the link to this paper can be found on the chat.
Lovely, thank you. Other questions that people have? No. Okay. Well, look, George, that was absolutely fascinating. I mean, both raised lots of issues for future research and interesting issues, but also a really nice kind of paper that's obviously taken a debate about polarization in the States and found something kind of rather different. So I guess you're contributing to a really live debate there. But that was a really nice paper, really nice presentation. Hope the comments have been useful.
They were very helpful.
And thanks very
a lot.
much. Great. Look forward to seeing it in print, hopefully fairly soon. Thank you everyone thank you everyone for coming, and George, thank you very much for coming to present today. Appreciated.
Thanks
Really
a lot.
enjoyed it. Thank you. Okay, nice to see everyone. See you in the new year with our next seminar, but I'll be in touch about that. Thanks everyone. Bye.